Question. Carl Linnaeus took his word genus from the Latin translation of kind in Genesis. How did he know that his classification of animals under kind/genus was the same as God's when God used the word in Genesis?
Okay, here's the simple point we've been making over and over again, and we would just pray for you to get hold of this. Carl von Linné lived in a world that had no classification system that worked. Point number one. Carl von Linné lived in a world where even the church was Greek up to there. All right, they claimed to be that they were Greek right up to the top. They had adopted the pagan Greek philosophy for everything outside of theology. So the Greeks had no means of identifying separate divisions amongst the animals and plants. They tried all sorts of clues. Do we use the color of the blood? So this animal's got red blood, this animal's got blue blood. No, that didn't work. Should we try the shape of the leaves? No, some plants don't have leaves, so that doesn't work. So the ancient Greeks had tried every which way plus loose to get a means to classify, because the Greek philosophy was the same as much of our modern scientists. Leave the real God out. Yes, they had many gods, but they didn't have the real God. They left him out just after the Tower of Babel. So they never managed to start with their religious philosophy and get an accurate means of classifying the world. Now, Carl von Linné lives just sort of after the Reformation. You find other names you might want to look up sometime. John Ray, a big help in the classification system. But in England and Europe, the Reformation had come, and there is a restoration in belief that the Bible is the Word of God, right? The Bible is the Word of God, and the God they believed in said, I made the world, I put my nature on the world, I do not change, right? That's his what he reveals about himself. Secondly, he said, I made them each after their kind. Now, Linnaeus didn't set up to prove that his definition matched God's definition. He set up to take the biblical picture and apply it. And for the first time in thousands of years, it actually worked, right? If God created dogs to produce their own kind, then dogs turn into dogs, right? Now, that's what we already knew, but the Greeks had totally confused us with wrong philosophies. So Carl von Linné and the others said, let's start with the biblical record. God says 10 times, and as John Mackay is famous for saying, anything God says 10 times in one chapter, you want to take notice of. He means you to listen. You got to watch what he says. I created this kind, I created that kind, and I did them all unrelated to each other. That's what the word kind means in English. That's what the word genus means in science. That's what the word min, the original Hebrew word, means in Hebrew, right? These are separate, unrelated groups. And so that's what Carl von Linné took the idea and ran with it. Now, to be honest, to give Carl Linné credit, he did notice that some of his definitions didn't quite match the biblical one of separate kinds. So he ended up having to lop that off into its own kind. And we still have the same problem. So is this new creature we've just found in Australia off the coast, is it its own kind, or is it related to something else in another group? And as Diane, you might want to talk about lumpers and splitters. That's a consequence of starting with Carl von Linné, but then realizing your definition, your observation might be a little bit of a problem, but the system works. We wouldn't have the classification system working unless Carl von Linné started with God's system. And last point from me, it works on the fossils too, which shouldn't be true if they're all the evidence of evolution. Diane, anything on lumpers and splitters?
Lumpers and splitters is a derogatory term that's used for people who study the science of taxonomy, which is the science of classification or the system of classification. And it all stems from the fact that as human beings, we like to try and organize our knowledge. And we like to organize our knowledge into things that are alike and things that are different. And when you're looking at living things and you're trying to determine which kind they fit into, you have to look at, well, we found this new thing. What does it have in common with things we already have? What is different? And are there more differences than there are similarities? And that's where the debates come in. Do we classify this thing as belonging to a kind we already know about, or do we give it a new name? So the lumpers are the ones who want to group things together and just have an expanding group with the same name. Splitters mean we found this new thing, we think it has more differences than it has similarities, so we'll put it into a new classified name. And it's a debate that goes on, and it's just simply related to the fact that we don't know everything, and we don't know everything about every organism, but we do our best. But we do find separate, distinct kinds. We never see one kind giving rise to another totally different kind. So Carl von Linne had the basic starting point. Now, the evolutionists have corrupted it to a certain extent in that they want to make the classification system, the organization of our knowledge, into evolutionary trees, where the bigger groups, such as a family or a phylum or things like that, are an evolutionary basis for all of the things that are within that big group actually evolved out of some base group. That's not true. The ones that we actually observe are at the level of the kind. But again, the classification system is simply a means of organizing our knowledge. It's never observed to be a means of where one thing has evolved into another. No one has ever seen that.
And that higher classification system was more to do with how he was going to organise it in his book than it
Yes.
was, you know,
That's right.
the core classification system that he used was the binomial system, which is
Yes.
the one based off that biblical concept of kind.
Yes, and that's what we actually observe.
And I think it's important to keep in mind the Bible's distinction was it consistently said to reproduce after their kind.
Yes.
The problem comes in with fossils. We don't know how they reproduce, and we can't do living experiments with them. But the other thing to keep in mind is that after Linnaeus' system, they added another level in there, the family level, which is just above the genus level. And some feel that really the distinction of how the Bible distinguishes kind fits maybe more at the family level that Linnaeus didn't have in his system that was added later.
And that's yeah, and it's more to do again with the fact that once you start interpreting it through evolutionary mindset, all of a sudden you're shoving genus further and further down because you're making it now in an order of history of life on Earth, fitted with the geological column and diversifying and evolving today. And so, you know, if evolution carries on, they'll soon need to fit another one in, because once we get into genetics, you'll start to find that you know, and off and off and off you go. So. Yeah, it's a fascinating study, but
it's a man-made system.
It's a man-made system.
Yes.